Julia Clark had never been the kind of woman who needed much from the world. Her hands were calloused from years of manual labor. Her boots were worn in the way only earned wear can produce. And her property, 10 acres on the edge of old farmland in central Texas, was both her sanctuary and her legacy. The land wasn't anything fancy, but it was hers. Her father bought it back in the 70s, carved it out of the wild with a second-hand chainsaw and a stubborn belief that hard work still meant something. When he passed, Julia inherited the land, the tools, the stubbornness, and most importantly, the principle that if you owned something, you protected it. Her days followed a rhythm. Up before the sun, coffee brewed dark and bitter, boots laced while the world still felt half asleep. Then it was out the door to check the fencing, clear debris from the old windbreak, feed the chickens, and often spend the rest of the morning tinkering in the workshop that her father had built by hand. The workshop was more than just a shed. It was the heart of her daily life. Inside were rows of tools, wooden drawers labeled in black marker, and machines that hadn't been made in the last 3 decades, but still ran because she kept them alive. Among them stood her pride, a 1971 Massey Ferguson tractor, red paint faded to a dusty russet, the kind of machine you couldn't kill if you tried. She'd done more than just maintain it. She'd restored it, cleaned every inch, rewired the ignition, replaced the transmission with one she pulled out of a salvage yard in Oklahoma. She used it for everything, hauling wood, turning soil, dragging brush. It was old, sure, but it was still stronger than anything you could buy new, and besides, it had a kind of soul. New machines didn't have. The tractor stayed parked right where it always had, just off the gravel driveway that led from the county road to her house. It wasn't in the way, it wasn't broken down. It was where it had always been, since her father first parked it there when Nixon was president. Julia didn't even think about it anymore. It was like a part of the land itself, weathered and patient. That is, until the morning she stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, and saw nothing but an empty patch of gravel and a few shallow tire grooves in the dirt. For a moment she stood still, blinking into the morning sun, convinced maybe her eyes hadn't adjusted or perhaps she'd moved it the night before and forgotten. But as she walked forward, the slow, cold realization spread up her spine like an unwelcome draft. The tractor was gone. At first she assumed theft. There had been rumors of break-ins a few miles down the highway. Maybe some meth head looking for scrap. But that didn't sit right. Nothing else had been touched. The workshop was locked tight. The chainsaw still hung on its hook, and the spare diesel drum remained where she'd left it. No tracks in the grass. No signs of forced entry. No broken locks or kicked-in doors. Just that one set of fresh tire grooves where something large had been hauled away. When she called the sheriff's department, she half expected them to dismiss it or tell her to file a report online. Instead, the dispatcher told her, without a hint of hesitation, "Oh, ma'am, I believe that was towed yesterday. Looked like it came from the neighborhood watch. You might want to contact the housing committee over in Cypress Hollow." Julia paused. Housing committee? Cypress Hollow? That was the new development up the road. A maze of beige 2-stories and imported palm trees. She'd seen the signs a few years back when they broke ground. A private community for elevated living. Whatever the hell that meant. Their boundaries had never crossed hers. Her property was county zoned, outside their annex with its own utility lines, own plat records, and more importantly, not under their authority. But now someone from that same community had taken it upon themselves to remove her tractor? She asked the dispatcher if there was a case number, a report, anything in writing. The woman sighed like this wasn't the first time someone had asked that question. "No, ma'am, I don't see anything logged on our end. You'll have to talk to them directly." That day, Julia drove to the entrance of Cypress Hollow. The gate opened automatically, cameras tracking her truck as she passed through. No security stopped her. No sign said she couldn't be there. Just a small white sign bolted near the road, easy to miss if you weren't looking. Community Association Oversight in effect. Contact property office for access rules. Julia followed the winding streets, each lined with perfect shrubs and artificial turf so green it looked ridiculous in the Texas sun. It made her uneasy. Too quiet, too staged. She stopped outside the management office, the clean, air-conditioned prefab with an appointment-only sign taped to the door. But she wasn't here for an appointment. She was here for her damn tractor. Inside, a young woman greeted her with a stiff, almost robotic smile and asked if Julia was on the list. Julia explained what happened, showed her driver's license, and asked where the tractor was. The receptionist made a phone call, eyes darting across Julia's worn flannel and dusty boots. A few minutes later, a tall man in a collared shirt and logo vest stepped out. Declan Grissom, Director of Community Standards. He spoke with the smooth confidence of someone used to never being challenged. "Miss Clark," he said, "thank you for coming in. We've been meaning to speak with you, actually. There's been a number of aesthetic concerns regarding your property's visibility from the community entrance. The committee determined the vehicle, the agricultural equipment, constituted a visual obstruction and a safety hazard." Julia blinked. "Aesthetic concerns? You towed a working tractor off my land because someone thought it looked bad?" Declan didn't blink. "It wasn't within our standards for perimeter compliance. That equipment was parked within visible range of our scenic entry zone, and as such, we acted in accordance with our temporary visual buffer authority." He handed her a printed document, a stapled packet labeled Perimeter Enhancement Directive, Addendum C. She flipped through it. Nothing made sense. Paragraphs of legalese, no dates, no maps, no references to her actual parcel number. "This isn't even enforceable," she said. "My land isn't part of your community. I've got my own plat, my own zoning. I'm not in any HOA." Declan gave her that corporate smile, the one that meant, "We don't care." "We understand there may be a technical dispute. However, the board has initiated oversight protocols for adjacent properties under visual impact clauses. It's common practice during expansion." She stared at him, feeling the weight of the absurdity settle like a rock in her gut. He was using phrases that sounded legal, sounded official, but had no foundation in reality. She wasn't under their control. She never had been. But they had acted like she was. And more than that, they'd acted with impunity, assuming that no one would push back. When she asked where the tractor was, Declan told her it had been moved to secure holding, pending resolution. She would need to schedule a release, pay the transport fees, and provide visual assurance documentation that it would not be returned to public line of sight. Julia asked for the address. He refused to give it, citing liability issues. "Once payment is processed," he said, "we'll facilitate delivery." She left the office shaking, not from fear, but from fury. A slow, deliberate kind of anger that boiled without ever spilling. She hadn't been asked, she hadn't been notified. She hadn't agreed to anything. They didn't even bother pretending she mattered. They acted like they had already won. And that was the moment something shifted. Julia Clark had lost things before. Her husband to a stroke, her mother to cancer, her patients to countless bureaucrats over the years. But she had never been outright robbed in plain daylight by people in polos with clipboards and polished words. She wasn't just going to get the tractor back. She was going to make sure they couldn't do this again. Not to her, not to anyone. The fight wasn't about metal and bolts. It was about the ground she stood on. The right to stand on it without permission, and the right to refuse. Julia didn't know the full extent of what she'd just stepped into. But she knew one thing for certain. She was done playing nice. It took Julia Clark less than 48 hours to understand that the situation she was in wasn't going to resolve itself. After her confrontation with Declan Grissom, she returned home in a state of controlled fury. The kind that didn't burn out quickly but smoldered under her skin, thick and pressurized. She went straight to her office and began pulling out every piece of paperwork related to her property. The deed, the tax assessments, the county plat map, zoning declarations from as far back as 1974. Everything confirmed what she already knew. Her land was never annexed into the neighboring subdivision, never subject to their bylaws, and was officially zoned as rural residential with agricultural rights. But the problem wasn't about facts anymore. It was about the assumption of power. Someone decided her property was within their reach and acted accordingly. She made 3 calls that night. The first was to the county clerk's office to confirm that no new zoning or annexation changes had been filed. The woman on the phone was helpful but cautious, and after digging through the records, she confirmed there were no changes related to Julia's parcel. "Your property's status hasn't changed in over 20 years, she said. "But I will say, we've had a few similar complaints recently. Some of these newer communities are interpreting buffer zones a little creatively. Julia thanked her, hung up, and immediately made her second call to the number listed on the printed packet Grissom had given her. It rang twice before an automated system picked up, cycling her through 6 different menus before dumping her into a voicemail box labeled Community Standards Violations. She left a short, curt message. "This is Julia Clark from County Road 229. You've taken my tractor without authority. I'm requesting an immediate location disclosure and release schedule. My parcel is not under your jurisdiction. I expect a response by morning." The third call was harder, to a local law firm she hadn't used in years. She'd last spoken to them when drafting her will after her husband passed, but she still had the card tucked in her filing cabinet. The receptionist sounded surprised to hear from her, but after Julia explained the basics of the situation, they scheduled her in for a consultation 2 days later. "We'll assign someone experienced in municipal and property disputes," the receptionist said. Julia hung up, made herself another pot of coffee despite the hour, and sat at the kitchen table staring at the plat map spread out before her. It was absurd that this was happening. And yet, the absurdity didn't make it any less real. The next morning, a letter appeared in her mailbox. Crisp white envelope, no return address, but postmarked from a nearby city. Inside was a formal notice titled Preliminary Notice of Compliance Review. The letter explained in vague legal language that, due to recent complaints regarding visual obstructions and property cohesion in adjacent community corridors, her property had been identified for review and alignment. It stated that temporary oversight would be exercised until the review was complete, and advised her to remove obstructive equipment and non-compliant installations to avoid potential penalties. There was no signature, just the stamp of Community Oversight Committee and a barcode in the corner. Julia felt her breath catch. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was deliberate. Someone, or some group, had crafted a paper trail, however weak, to justify what they'd done. They were building a narrative, piece by piece, and if she didn't act fast, she would be written into it as the obstruction, the problem they were solving. When she arrived for her legal consultation, the attorney assigned to her, a woman in her late 30s named Donna Moreau, wasted no time getting to the heart of things. She reviewed the documents, listened closely, then leaned back in her chair and said, "They're testing boundaries, not just physically, jurisdictionally. If you don't push back hard and fast, they'll escalate. They'll treat your silence as consent." Julia explained that she hadn't been silent. She'd confronted the director, sent messages, made phone calls. Dana nodded. "Good. Keep documenting everything, every letter, every voicemail, every interaction, and don't let them frame this as a dispute. This isn't a neighborly disagreement, it's unauthorized property action. Language matters here." They drafted a formal cease and desist letter that same afternoon and sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested. Dana also filed a records request with the county to investigate whether the housing committee had ever filed paperwork to justify their supposed visual buffer zone. The county response would take at least a week, but Dana seemed confident. They're banking on intimidation. That's their tactic. They'll use bureaucracy like a weapon. Delay, obfuscate, confuse. We're going to hold them to the actual law. That evening, Julia drove past the holding lot where Grissom had implied her tractor was stored. It was a fenced-in storage facility off a service road, surrounded by cameras and steel gates. She stopped at the entrance and buzzed the intercom, asking if they had any record of her tractor. The man on the other end said they didn't release information to non-clients. She pressed further. Was a red Massey Ferguson brought in 2 days ago? A pause. Then, "You'll have to speak with your HOA representative." Click. The line went dead. Back home, she opened her laptop and began compiling a record. Dates, times, phone numbers, copies of her deed, maps, photographs of where the tractor had been parked, and screenshots of the community's website. Something caught her eye. A map embedded on the site labeled Expanded Visual Zone Overlay. It showed a highlighted area that extended nearly a quarter-mile beyond the development's official boundary, wrapping around adjacent properties, including hers. She zoomed in. There, plain as day, her workshop was inside the pink-shaded region, labeled Phase 4 Integration. There had been no notices about this, No discussion, no hearings. It was a unilateral claim, masked as planning. Julia printed it, then printed everything else. She wasn't going to let them erase her without a fight. The following morning, a man came to her property. She spotted him from the kitchen window, walking along the perimeter of her front fence, clipboard in hand, phone out, taking photos. She stepped outside and called to him. He looked up, startled, then raised a hand like he was waving off the tension. "Just assessing for compliance," he said. "Visual boundary documentation." Julia stepped through the gate and stood in front of him. "Who sent you?" she asked. He hesitated. "Community Oversight Committee." She pointed down the road. "That community ends half a mile south. This is private property." He didn't argue, just nodded, took one last photo, and walked away. By the time Dana called her that afternoon, Julia had already written a second demand letter, this one addressing the trespass. Dana told her the county had responded. No such visual expansion had ever been approved or recorded. The highlighted zone on the website had no legal standing. "They're manufacturing jurisdiction," Dana said. "It's smoke and mirrors, but it only works if you don't challenge it." Julia now understood the game. They weren't just trying to intimidate her into moving the tractor. They were laying the groundwork to redefine her land as theirs, culturally, visually, administratively, without ever filing a legal claim. It was control by assumption, not law, and if they succeeded, she'd have no say when the next structure went up near her fence, or when another vehicle was towed, or when her driveway was reassigned as a shared access path. So she did the only thing that made sense. She locked her gate, added cameras facing the road, installed 2 signs, private property, no trespassing, and not a member of any community association, and she waited. They had crossed a line. She wasn't going to let them cross another. The first real crack in Julia's confidence came not from any legal misstep or loss in the process, but from the subtle and unnerving way the pressure began to surround her on all sides. It didn't arrive as a single catastrophic blow, but rather as a collection of small, calculated intrusions, each one insignificant on its own, but together forming a pattern that felt anything but accidental. The first was a letter, thinner than the others, folded with unnecessary precision and placed not in her mailbox, but under a stone on her porch. No envelope, no sender. Just a note printed on high-gloss paper. Visual standards exist for everyone's benefit. Cooperation ensures peace. The words weren't threatening, but they didn't need to be. It wasn't about what was written. It was about how it was delivered. Someone had come onto her property. Quietly, without knocking, without being seen. She stood there for a moment after reading it, staring down the driveway, watching the trees. Her cameras hadn't triggered. That meant whoever left the message had known the blind spots. That night, she re-angled the cameras, added another at the corner of her tool shed, and stayed up past midnight going through the previous 48 hours of footage. Nothing. Just a few trucks passing by. A neighbor walking a dog near dusk. Nothing that showed a stranger near the porch. That absence gnawed at her more than any note could have. The following day, she received a visit. Not a call, not a letter. A visit. A man in a pressed short-sleeved dress shirt and aviator sunglasses pulled up in a spotless white SUV bearing the branding of the Cypress Hollow Development Group. He didn't park in her driveway as he quoted. He stopped just short of the cattle gate and waited until she stepped outside to wave him in. She didn't. Instead, she walked down to the fence, arms folded, and met him through the bars. He introduced himself as Alan Pierce, Liaison for Community Relations. The phrase made her stomach tighten. He started with compliments. The land was beautiful, clearly well-maintained. She had a reputation, he said, for being one of the more steadfast original property owners. A phrase that made her feel like a leftover from a world they were working hard to erase. He didn't mention the tractor. He didn't have to. He moved quickly into talk about future infrastructure alignment and ongoing plans to create continuity between private and communal spaces. It was all nonsense. Marketing jargon disguised as diplomacy. Julia let him talk until he got to the part that mattered. There's a long-term initiative underway, he said, to integrate neighboring parcels into a unified visual corridor. There would be benefits, of course: services, support, alignment with higher property values. She cut him off there. "You mean annexation," she said flatly. "I mean theft with better PR." Alan didn't flinch. He smiled, the kind of polite, non-confrontational smile that was designed to diffuse anger without ever acknowledging it. "We prefer the term community harmonization," he said. Julia felt something sharp rise in her chest. She told him, clearly and without hesitation, that her property was not for sale, not for lease, not for realignment, and that further contact should go through her attorney. He left without raising his voice, but the look in his eyes just before he turned to walk back to the SUV was something cold and calculating. It said, "This isn't over." The escalation after that came fast. Julia began receiving noise complaints filed through the county. One claimed her workshop was violating decibel ordinances with agricultural equipment in use outside permitted hours. Another claimed she was storing abandoned vehicles in public view. The most absurd claimed her chickens were a health hazard to adjacent family spaces. Each time, a county inspector was obligated to follow up, and each time they left apologetically. There were no violations, but the pattern was clear. Someone was flooding the system with petty grievances, not to win any real legal victories, but to wear her down, to make her feel like she was living under siege. And then came the damage. One morning, as she walked out to the shed to refill feed for the hens, she noticed the side panel of the workshop door hanging awkwardly. It had been pried loose, not fully opened, but enough to leave a gap. Nothing was stolen, but someone had been inside. One of the cabinets was ajar, a few bolts scattered on the floor. Her inventory list, always pinned neatly to the wall, had been taken down and left lying on her workbench. That was the part that got to her. Someone had looked through it, then left it out in plain sight. Not to steal, to signal. To say, "We were here, and we're not afraid of you." She filed a report with the sheriff, but it went nowhere. There were no witnesses, no cameras caught it, no fingerprints. "Might have been kids," the deputy said, non-committal. Julia nodded like she believed him, but she didn't. Kids don't open tool cabinets and lay out documents like they're studying something. Kids don't leave half-screwed hinges behind to make a point. Adults do. Adults who want you to know they're watching. Dana, her lawyer, was growing more concerned. She began pushing harder, not just sending cease and desist notices, but drafting formal filings with the county zoning board, demanding that the expansion maps used by the Cypress Hollow Committee be formally removed from the community's promotional materials. That prompted a response at last. A letter long and dense, citing ongoing discussions with adjacent parcel owners and community cohesion pilot initiatives. But now there was another twist. The letter included an invitation for Julia to attend an upcoming development board meeting as a courtesy to discuss shared visual alignment goals. The language was deliberately benign, but to Julia it read like a demand. "Show up, or we'll act like you agreed with whatever happens in your absence." She didn't attend. Instead, she sent Dana as her legal representative, with written objections and documentation in hand. At the meeting, Dana said later, there were slides presented that used Julia's property as a transitional plot between the community core and the rural perimeter. Her workshop was labeled non-conforming visual obstruction. Her driveway was marked as future integrated access corridor. They were speaking as though the process had already begun, as if ownership was just a formality waiting for public approval. Then came the final insult. The community's website updated overnight. The new visual planning page featured a digital rendering of the neighborhood's entrance, complete with green space, walkways, and right where her land should have been, a blank tree-filled greenway buffer. No structures, no workshop, no tractor. It had been erased from the vision entirely, as if she didn't exist. Julia stood in front of her shop that night, floodlights humming above her, staring out at the road. She wasn't scared, she was tired. Not of the fight, but of the way they were waging it. Without names, without accountability. Hiding behind policy and emails and phrases like alignment and future integration. It wasn't just bureaucracy, it was strategy. A slow suffocation wrapped in good manners. But what they didn't know or had chosen to ignore, was that Julia had lived her whole life resisting pressure. She'd fought to keep her family's land through lean years and storms and tax hikes and personal grief. This wasn't the first time someone tried to tell her what she was allowed to be, but it might be the last time someone tried it without consequence. Because tomorrow she was going to court, not to file another complaint, but to begin tearing their strategy apart, piece by piece. Julia stepped into the county courthouse not with the stiffness of someone hoping to be heard, but with the deliberate posture of someone who had no intention of being ignored. Dana walked beside her, briefcase in hand, composed and focused, her eyes already scanning the front desk for the clerk. They had an appointment, not for a hearing, not yet, but for a procedural filing. The goal was simple: force a legal review of the so-called buffer zone policy that the developers of Cypress Hollow had been leaning on to excuse their expanding control. What they lacked in legal standing, they had tried to compensate for through inertia, moving fast, acting without consent, and hoping nobody had the energy to fight back. Julia had plenty of energy now. The clerk who received them was professional, courteous, and clearly well-versed in handling filings from attorneys who were already deep into a property dispute. Dana handed over the stack of forms: complaint, injunctive request, zoning conflict challenge, and a motion for declaratory relief, asking the court to confirm that Julia's property lay outside the jurisdiction of any non-governmental neighborhood authority and that any encroachment based on visual regulations had no lawful basis. The clerk stamped each page methodically, issued a case number, and gave them a date for a preliminary hearing, 4 weeks out. It wasn't immediate, but it was real. It was official. For the first time in over a month, Julia had the feeling that the ground beneath her feet belonged to her again. Not just in paperwork, but in principle. Outside the courthouse, Dana lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly, eyes on the horizon. "They're going to come hard now," she said. "They'll try to discredit you. Probably try to flip the narrative. Paint you as uncooperative, unstable, a barrier to community improvement." Julia didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. They both knew that what was coming next wasn't going to be quiet. But Julia had no interest in being quiet either. 2 days later, the retaliation began in earnest. Julia was served with a violation notice, a real one this time, delivered by certified mail and bearing an official-looking seal. It accused her of unregulated vehicle maintenance and environmental debris accumulation based on a recent anonymous report. Attached were photos, blurry, cropped too tightly to show context, of the rear of her workshop, where a few rusted implements leaned against the wall, and of a tarp-covered pile of reclaimed fencing materials. Eyesore was the word used in the report, though not in legal terms. Dana quickly responded with a rebuttal and photographic evidence of the same locations, taken from a wider angle, proving the images had been manipulated or taken out of context. It was enough to stop any fines from being issued, but that wasn't the point. They weren't trying to win. They were trying to exhaust her. What they didn't expect was the email that arrived the following week. It came from a man named Patrick Cleary, who introduced himself as an assistant land surveyor with a private firm contracted by the county a few years back. He'd seen Julia's name on the public docket and recognized the parcel ID. His message was short, polite, but pointed. He said there were inconsistencies between the developer-submitted maps and the last verified county topographic record from when the subdivision was approved. He wasn't offering testimony, not yet, but he was willing to talk. Dana followed up immediately, and within a few days she and Julia met Patrick at a diner off the highway. He came alone carrying a binder and a worn canvas folder. What he showed them was damning. The community's planning documents, the ones used to create their promotional materials and justify the visual corridor, contained overlays that had quietly moved the visual boundary into Julia's property by nearly 60 feet in some places. It didn't appear in the official plat filings. It didn't appear in county GIS. But it did appear on the maps distributed to buyers, stakeholders, and the community committee. "I didn't think anything of it back then," Patrick said. "They said it was just for design renderings, but I looked closer after your lawyer called. They've been using that version for every proposal since. The language is always vague enough to avoid liability, but the visuals, they tell another story." Julia felt a bitter satisfaction rise in her chest. It wasn't just paranoia. It wasn't just resistance to change. They had in fact been drawing lines that didn't belong to them, and calling it planning. Dana filed a supplemental declaration the next morning, attaching Patrick's notes and requesting the court issue a temporary protective order, barring the Cypress Hollow Group from publishing or distributing any materials that visually misrepresented Julia's land. While that process crawled forward, something else shifted. Julia started noticing changes in tone, from the neighbors, from the committee's responses, even in the way the county handled their inquiries. The balance was tipping, just slightly. No one apologized. No one admitted wrongdoing. But the frequency of letters slowed. The casual surveillance stopped. The man with the clipboard didn't return. But then something unexpected happened. Julia received an invitation to meet. Not with the committee, but with the head of the development company that managed Cypress Hollow. It was delivered by courier, sealed in a heavy linen envelope, with her name printed in raised ink on the front. Inside, a single card, an invitation to a private lunch at the local country club, signed personally by the managing director. There was no agenda listed, just a date, a time, and a note. "We'd value the opportunity to find mutual understanding." Dana advised against it. "They're not extending courtesy, they're testing your tolerance. You sit down with them, they'll twist the story. Make it seem like you're open to compromise." Julia understood. She didn't want compromise, she wanted truth. But she also knew something Dana didn't. Something about how men like that worked. She'd grown up watching her father negotiate with land agents and insurance adjusters, oil reps and cattle brokers. Sometimes you learn more by letting people think they're winning, so she agreed. And when she walked into that quiet dining room at the club, dressed not in her work clothes but in the kind of pressed button-down that made her feel armored, she didn't flinch. The man she met, a well-spoken executive type named Carl Venn, greeted her like an old friend, full of apologies and charm. He acknowledged the tension, the overreach, the unfortunate handling of what he called a boundary miscommunication. But buried beneath the velvet tone was the same threat Julia had been hearing all along. Let this go, and we'll all move on. Don't, and it becomes much more difficult for everyone. She didn't take the bait. She let him talk, nodded when appropriate, smiled once or twice, and then politely declined every offer he made. Money, services, partnership in a future transition project. When he asked what it would take for her to consider alignment, she leaned in and said, without hesitation, "A ruling from a judge that says I don't have to." She left the meeting without shaking his hand, and that night, for the first time in weeks, she slept without keeping a shotgun next to the bed. The line had been drawn, not in ink, not in theory, but in action. And the next move was hers. It was in the weeks following her meeting with Carl Venn that Julia realized the true scope of the battle she had unwittingly entered. It wasn't just about property rights anymore, or even the tractor. It was about the entire system of power and control that had quietly been reshaping the land around her for years. She had thought, perhaps naively, that the committee's desire to annex her property was an isolated case, a bureaucratic misstep. But the more she dug, the more she saw that the real issue was much larger than any single piece of land. It was the entire development project, carefully crafted and shielded behind layers of paperwork, marketing slogans, and community cohesion rhetoric. Julia had become an unexpected roadblock in a much bigger plan. What Carl Venn had hinted at during their lunch, a quiet suggestion that her resistance might be costing them more than she realized, was beginning to manifest in real and threatening ways. The legal motions filed by Dana were still working their way through the system, but in the meantime, the development company and the committee had doubled down. They weren't going to give up that easily. They had resources, they had influence, and they had no intention of letting one individual stand in the way of their carefully laid out agenda. The first sign of this shift came in the form of a second violation notice, this one more serious, more urgent. It was hand-delivered by an officer of the county sheriff's department, who had the air of someone used to dealing with people who didn't know when to back down. Julia took the paper, her fingers brushing against the stiff, thick stock of the document. It accused her of failing to comply with the original notice she had received, claiming that she had not made any effort to move the visual obstruction, the tractor, and that she had violated local zoning ordinances by operating it within the designated visual corridor. The penalty for non-compliance was steep, a fine, and if not paid within 30 days, a potential lawsuit. The language was aggressive, but it was the implied threat that chilled her to the core. It was clear now that this wasn't just about the tractor or her land. It was a warning shot aimed at her resolve. Dana had warned her that things would escalate, but the speed at which it happened took Julia by surprise. The committee's response to her legal filings had been swift and coordinated. The violation notice was just the beginning. The next day, another letter arrived, this time from the developer's legal team. It was a cease and desist order, demanding that Julia immediately cease any further communication with the county or any public bodies regarding the disputed property boundaries. The letter threatened both civil and criminal penalties if she continued to mislead the court or local authorities. It was a thinly veiled attempt to silence her, to stop her from pursuing her case and from drawing attention to the fact that they had acted illegally in the first place. The audacity of it was staggering, and for a moment, Julia felt herself caught in the undertow of it all. The legal threats, the financial pressure, the social isolation. But then she remembered the message Dana had given her from the very beginning. They were going to try to overwhelm her, to push her into a corner where it was easier to give up. She had no intention of letting them win. Dana was already ahead of the curve. The same day Julia received the cease and desist letter, Dana filed a motion for an emergency injunction. She argued that the developer's actions were not only unlawful but also coercive, and that the continuing harassment was damaging Julia's ability to work and live freely on her property. The motion was aimed at halting any further legal action from the developers until the court could fully review the claims. Dana also suggested that they request a protective order, a more aggressive step that would prevent the developers from harassing Julia or attempting to intimidate her into dropping her case. The court's response was fast and precise. They agreed to review the injunction and set a hearing date within 2 weeks. But things weren't just happening in the courts. The pressure was mounting in the neighborhood as well. Julia began noticing more and more cars parked outside her property, slowing as they passed by. At first, she thought they were just curious onlookers, but after the third day in a row, she realized something was off. These weren't random people. These were committee members, or people connected to the developers. They were watching her. They were waiting. And then the phone call started. One afternoon, Julia received a call from an unknown number. It was a man, speaking with a practiced politeness that only made his words more insidious. "Ms. Clark," he said, "I'm afraid the committee has decided that your refusal to cooperate is holding up progress. You're becoming a problem. If you don't agree to a meeting, we may have to take further action. You wouldn't want to risk a lawsuit, would you?" The words were calculated, meant to sound like a friendly suggestion, but the implication was clear. He wasn't asking, he was telling. Julia hung up before he could say more, but the message had landed. She had known it was coming, but hearing it out loud felt different. There was no longer any pretense of trying to resolve things amicably. This was about power. This was about forcing her into submission, making her so exhausted by the fight that she'd give up. They were willing to play dirty, and they had a much bigger arsenal than she did. The night after the call, Julia sat alone at the kitchen table, her mind racing. The sheer scale of what she was up against was starting to sink in. It wasn't just a few angry neighbors. It wasn't just about the tractor. It was about her right to exist on her own land, without someone else dictating what she could do with it. The developers weren't going to stop, not until they had achieved their goal. She could feel the weight of their presence pressing on her, even from behind the walls of her house. And yet, in the silence of her kitchen, she realized that they had underestimated her. They thought they could scare her into compliance. They thought they could break her spirit, but Julia wasn't going to back down. She wasn't the type to give in to threats. She was the type to fight. And she was going to fight for every inch of land that was rightfully hers. The next day, she did something unexpected. She called the local newspaper. It wasn't the kind of thing she usually did. Julia had always kept to herself, never one for attention. But this time, the situation was bigger than her, and if she was going to fight back, she needed the world to know what was happening. She explained everything to a reporter named Claire Hamilton, who was intrigued by the story. After a series of phone calls, Claire agreed to cover the story in the paper, with an emphasis on the legal overreach of the developers and the intimidation tactics they had used against Julia. It wasn't a story about Julia Clark alone. It was a story about the ways developers, using their influence and power, were bulldozing over the rights of individual landowners. all in the name of progress. The article was published a few days later, and when Julia saw it in print, she felt something shift inside her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been bullied into silence by forces bigger than them. She wasn't alone. The media attention caught the developers off guard. Carl then called Julia the next morning, his voice uncharacteristically tense. "This isn't the kind of attention you want, Miss Clark," he said, attempting to sound calm. "You're only making this harder on yourself." Julia didn't answer immediately. She let the silence hang in the air, letting him stew in his frustration. Finally, she spoke, her voice clear and unyielding. "You're not going to intimidate me, not with threats, not with your lawyers, and not with your press releases." It was at that moment that Julia knew she had crossed a line. There was no going back now. This was no longer just a battle over property boundaries. It was a fight for her autonomy, for her right to stand her ground. And if they thought she was going to back down just because they had money, influence, and the law on their side, they were sorely mistaken. Because now it was personal. The final hearing before the judge was unlike any of the legal proceedings Julia had experienced up until that point. It wasn't just a matter of waiting for a decision or a simple back and forth between opposing sides. This was the culmination of everything she had endured. The late nights spent poring over legal documents, the endless calls with Dana, the threats and intimidation tactics from the developers, the constant weight of being watched. It was now or never. She could feel the tension in her body as she sat in the courtroom, hands gripping the back of the chair, her thoughts racing despite the calm exterior she forced herself to maintain. On one side of the room sat the developer's legal team, a group of sharp-suited, well-groomed men and women who had no problem wearing the quiet arrogance that came with their resources. On the other side sat Julia, with Dana by her side and her own stack of evidence. Not just a pile of papers, but the years of struggle and determination she had poured into her fight. They had underestimated her. They had thought that by applying pressure through their letters, their lawsuits, their quiet manipulation, they could force her to bend. They were wrong. The courtroom was filled with a low murmur of whispered conversations as the judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Martin, entered and took her seat. The room fell silent as the proceedings began, and Julia's eyes locked onto the judge's face, trying to read her. She had no idea what the outcome would be, but she did know this. She had put everything on the line. She wasn't going to lose this. Dana stood and made the opening argument with a calm, measured voice, outlining the case against the developers. She didn't waste time with rhetoric. She simply laid out the facts, the legal precedents, and the violations that had taken place. They had used vague zoning laws and visual corridor guidelines to justify their claim on Julia's property, and it was clear that there had been no proper legal filing or legitimate process to back up their assertions. It was a clear case of overreach, one that had been masked by layers of legal jargon and market-driven development strategies. She pointed out that the developers had ignored Julia's rightful claim to her land, trying instead to strip her of ownership through bureaucratic sleight of hand. There was no law that granted them the power to simply redraw property boundaries, because they felt it would make their development more aesthetically pleasing. Julia listened as Dana spoke, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the countless nights she had spent trying to make sense of the paperwork, of the decisions that had been made behind her back, of the way the developers had come into her life. Without asking, and tried to bulldoze everything she had worked for. She thought about her father's hands on the tractor wheel, his call-soused fingers turning the engine over, and how he had always told her that land wasn't just property. It was history, legacy, and blood. And in the face of everything that had been thrown at her, she realized something. This wasn't just about the tractor or the land. It was about the fundamental right to own something without fear of having it taken from you, to live without being quietly erased by forces larger than yourself. She wasn't going to let them take that away. She wouldn't let them rewrite her history. When the developers' legal team stood to present their argument, Julia noticed the difference between their approach and Dana's. There was a polished, almost clinical nature to their presentation, a smooth flow of words that danced around the core of the issue. They didn't deny the violations or the overreach. Instead, they tried to shift the focus, painting Julia as a stubborn outlier, someone who refused to be a part of the greater good. They spoke about the need for cohesion, about how her refusal to comply was holding back the progress of the entire development. They made it sound like she was standing in the way of a brighter future for everyone. They even had a map prepared, a detailed visual representation of the community vision, showing Julia's land as part of an imagined, integrated space. They tried to make it seem like a simple matter of vision and aesthetics, but Julia wasn't fooled. She had seen through their tactics from the beginning. Then it was time for Julia to speak. For a moment, she just stood there, her hands steady at her sides, looking out over the room. She wasn't used to public speaking. She wasn't a lawyer, a politician, or a professional negotiator. But she was a woman who knew her land, who knew her rights, and who wasn't going to let anyone tell her what she could or couldn't do with it. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried in the stillness of the room. She started with a simple question. What gives them the right to change the rules when it's convenient for them? The room went silent as everyone turned their attention toward her. She didn't look at the developers, didn't look at the judge. She focused on the space in front of her, gathering her thoughts. I've spent my whole life here, she continued, her voice growing firmer with each word. This land, this workshop, this tractor, this soil, it's mine. It's been mine for as long as I can remember. I'm not some outlier, and I'm not a problem. I'm a landowner, and I'm standing here today because I believe that no one, no matter how big or how rich, has the right to take away what belongs to me without my consent. Not because it's easier for them, not because it fits their vision. This is my land, and if you want to take it, you're going to have to take it from me, and you'll have to do it legally. Julia's words hung in the air for a long moment. She wasn't angry anymore. There was no fire in her chest, no rush of emotion. There was just the quiet certainty that she had done everything she could to protect what was hers. She had fought for it, and now she would wait for the decision, knowing that the fight wasn't just hers, but it was for anyone who had ever been overlooked, intimidated, or pushed aside by forces too large for them to fight on their own. The judge listened attentively, not interrupting. When Julia finished, Dana stood beside her, making the final argument in support of Julia's rights. They didn't need to repeat everything. The evidence spoke for itself. The developers had failed to establish any legal claim over the land, and their arguments about visual continuity were nothing more than a thinly veiled attempt to force a land grab. The law was clear. The property was Julia's. Judge Martin took a long time to deliberate. She read through the documents again, her gaze steady, occasionally glancing at the evidence laid before her. The silence in the courtroom was palpable. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and strong. This court recognizes the rights of property owners, and it acknowledges the illegal actions taken by the developers in this case. The zoning laws were misused. The boundaries were altered without legal justification. Julia Clark's property is not part of the development, and it will not be taken or changed without proper due process. The room went still. Julia's heart raced in her chest, but she didn't move. She waited. The judge's decision was a victory, but it wasn't just about the legal precedent it set. It wasn't just about the developers being forced to back down or the fines they would face. It was about something more fundamental. Julia had won because she had refused to let them push her around. She had refused to be part of their system, their narrative. She had chosen to stand alone, and in doing so, she had shown the world that even the smallest voice could be heard if it was loud enough, persistent enough, and unafraid. The judge ruled in Julia's favor, and the developers were ordered to cease their attempts to claim her land. The community vision was redrawn, and Julia's property was restored to its rightful place in the records. The developers had to pay damages for the distress and harassment they had caused, and they were banned from pursuing any further action against her property. Julia walked out of the courthouse that day with her head held high. The battle was over, for now at least. But she knew something that the developers hadn't understood. This was her land. It always had been, and it always would be. The aftermath of the court ruling was, in a way, almost anticlimactic. Julia expected a wave of relief, but instead it felt like a subtle shift, a quiet kind of peace that settled over her land. The developers had been forced to retreat, their claims nullified by the court's decisive ruling, but they didn't leave quietly. It was the subtle things that bothered her more than anything else. The silence from the county office, where she had once received nothing but formalities. the sudden disappearance of the community outreach emails that had filled her inbox for months, and the fact that she hadn't seen a single familiar face from Cypress Hollow since the day the judge's decision came down. It was as if they had retreated into the shadows, taking their ambitions with them, but their absence left an odd emptiness that lingered. Julia didn't feel like she had won as much as she had simply survived. The first few days after the ruling were quiet, but they weren't peaceful. She spent hours at her kitchen table going over every document again, making sure everything was in order, every box ticked. The thought of the developers trying again, using a different method, a different strategy, gnawed at her. The battle was over, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the war was still ongoing. No one had asked her for an apology. No one had tried to make things right. The developers had paid their fines, as ordered, but they hadn't acknowledged the damage they'd caused. Julia's property had been re-recognized in the records, but she knew they would be watching, lurking in the background, waiting for an opportunity to make their move again. And so she kept her eyes open, remaining vigilant. But the quiet did have its advantages. Over the following months, Julia found herself reconnecting with the land in ways she hadn't in years. It was a strange kind of reclamation. The first morning after the ruling, she walked out to the workshop with a feeling she hadn't had in a long time. That sense of ownership, of control over the space she had built with her own hands. It wasn't just about the legal victory. It was about the freedom to stand on her land without anyone else's shadow looming over her. She didn't have to look over her shoulder anymore. She could wake up, go about her day, and know that she had reclaimed something that was always meant to be hers. Her neighbors, too, began to treat her differently. At first, there was hesitance. People who had once avoided her, who had whispered behind her back, began to approach her with newfound respect. Some even offered apologies, however clumsy. It wasn't much, but it was something. It wasn't a community of friends, and Julia wasn't looking for that. But she realized, standing in her yard one afternoon, while a neighbor waved from across the fence, that she didn't need to be isolated anymore. The fight had made her stronger, more sure of herself, but it had also opened up the possibility for something she hadn't thought about before. Connection. Not because she wanted to fit into the vision the developers had, but because she had earned her place in that neighborhood. Not by complying, but by standing firm. In the months that followed, Julia turned her attention back to her work. The tractor, once again parked in its rightful spot, was put to good use hauling timber, plowing the fields and carrying supplies. The workshop came back to life, with orders coming in from nearby farms and ranches for the repairs and restorations she specialized in. The land, too, had taken on a new significance. It wasn't just something that anchored her to the past, to her father's memory. It was something that would carry her into the future. She began to think about the next steps. Not just surviving, but thriving. She had learned how to fight for what was hers, but she also realized that there were other, quieter ways to build a future. Dana remained her trusted legal advisor, but as time went on, their relationship shifted from client and lawyer to something closer to friendship. Dana had been with her every step of the way, guiding her through the legal labyrinth, but Julia knew that the fight had only been won because of her own strength and determination. They continued to speak regularly, but it was no longer about strategy or motions. It was about life, about what Julia would do next, and about what she had learned about herself in the process. They talked about opening up a new shop, possibly expanding to offer repairs for more modern equipment, or even creating a line of custom-made tools. For the first time in a long while, Julia allowed herself to dream about the future. The developers, for their part, stayed silent after the ruling. They didn't make any more moves against her property, and there were no more letters, no more intimidation tactics. It was almost as if they had written her off completely, moving on to greener pastures, so to speak. Julia didn't care. She didn't need them to acknowledge her victory. She didn't need anyone to validate her actions. She had stood her ground, and that was enough. But as the months turned into a year, Julia realized that she had done more than just protect her land. She had changed something within herself. The fight had forced her to confront the limits of her own resolve, to test her boundaries and find strength she hadn't known she had. And now she felt more capable of moving forward than ever before. She wasn't just a landowner. She wasn't just a farmer. She was someone who could look at any challenge, no matter how large, and know that she could handle it. The last piece of the puzzle fell into place one crisp autumn morning when Julia received a letter from the county's planning department. It wasn't from the developers, but from the county itself. The letter was an official notification. The boundary lines for her property had been re-verified and officially recorded. Her legal claim was now indisputable. The county had reviewed all the zoning changes that had been pushed through by Cypress Hollow, and they had found irregularities that would need to be addressed. The developers were being asked to amend their plans, and Julia's land was officially removed from any future expansions. It was a quiet victory, but one that felt profoundly satisfying. She had not only protected what was hers, but she had ensured that no one could take it away again. It was the final chapter in the battle that had defined her life for the past year, and it felt like the most important one of all. Julia stood on her porch that morning, looking out at the land she had fought so hard to keep. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows over the fields. She didn't need to fight anymore. The fight had been won. What she had now was something far more precious. Peace. She didn't have to worry about someone else's vision for her life. She could live it on her own terms, and that was enough. She had earned it. The land was hers, and so was her future. No one could take that away from her. The world might change around her. The landscape might shift. But as long as she was standing here, on this land, she knew that no matter what happened, she had everything she needed to keep moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, Julia felt like she was truly free.